Hi, welcome to another exciting episode on Untold Alternatives podcast. Please remember to subscribe to this channel, share the link, and share your thoughts in the comment section. I'm your host, Christian Ibega, and today with me is Happy.
Thank you. My name is Happy Matthew Tirwankas. I am a doctoral researcher at the University of Jyväskylä in Finland.
And Happy researches climate change mitigation and adaptation in the global south. He has enormous publications in Southern African region and has consulting experience with international organizations as well. He's actually a political and environmental sociologist. He is from Zimbabwe. Happy, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for just like what you said. I have a bit of experience in Southern Africa, that's where I was educated. I was educated at the University of Limpopo in South Africa. I still work with them, and I still also work with the University of Venda.
Great.
That is also in South Africa.
Great,
Yeah.
great. We're excited to have you on this conversation.
Yeah.
You've written a lot about Afrocentric perspectives. Can you tell us about it? What is it about?
Thank you. I like it because you are bringing my niche area. So I am not the one who started with Afrocentricity. Afrocentricity, it started probably as a movement, but the pioneer of this theory is Molefe Asante. That is an African-American scholar. Prof. Asante, around 1980s, but he decided to bring out together the issues to answer the questions for us Africans, to find a place for Africans. So in a way, in terms of how we investigate our problems that are emanating from our environment, that be it Africans that are in diaspora or Africans that are in the motherland continent, Africa, right?
Yeah.
So Afrocentricity, it places Africans on the center of their research. You understand?
Yeah.
So it's something we are saying that for long we've been discentered. We've been removed
Displaced,
from
yeah.
the center.
Mm-hmm.
We used other people's narratives
Right.
in terms of for us to investigate our own problems. You understand?
Right.
So now it's like the idea is an African man is not on the periphery of human history. An African man is a subject of history. An African man is an agent of history. So whatever subject that you research on, you have to find what can an African understand about this. You understand?
Right.
So now Afrocentricity finds you a place as an African researcher. We are drawing on our experiences. Before we have America, before we have all the Europeans and other, be it Chinese, right?
Yeah.
What can an African, what do you think about the current problems that you are facing? What is the role of an African when you are faced with the challenges, right? There's a feeling that Africans have long been removed from their own narrative. You understand?
Right.
So the question is a question of epistemic. It's an epistemic question. How do we arrive at what we know today, right? So now we're saying that instead of relying on somebody else's narrative, what does your history say? What does your culture say? Right?
Right.
How do you envision these current circumstances that you are facing? So that is where an Afrocentricist, those are the things that you have to ask yourself, the questions that you have to ask yourself when you are investigating a problem, or when you are looking at a phenomenon that is currently affecting people.
Great. This perspective actually is one that is, laden with nuances from what I've read in papers recently. What has the historical trajectory of this perspective been like?
Okay, myself as a young scholar, I'm not speaking from a very experienced position, but I'm speaking as a young scholar who is taking this niche area. Okay?
Okay, great.
So you'll find that Professor Sante and among other scholars, like even if you think of Kwame Nkrumah, who were advocating for the African voice,
Yeah.
right? So it's something that started earlier there in the 80s, 60s, 80s there, right? But of course, with Professor Ante writing the Afrocentric Manifesto in the 1981, 80s, right? Bringing the ideas together. But as for us, as young scholars, we only started taking this after 2015, when the actual writing started. Because you can imagine that in the early 2000s, few scholars in the academia were interested in actually writing. But for me, because I am starting now, but I can say I'm starting now, but I can say that as a young emerging scholar, we only managed to adopt Afrocentricity right around 2015, 2016 to the present. With you can imagine that is where decolonial movement gained track, right? Yes. So now many scholars are now adopting Afrocentricity. They are now adopting other indigenous methods because of the decolonial movement that is gaining track now.
Great.
Yeah, and more of now we are interested in finding the African voice. We are interested because the more that you are relying on other people's epistemic voice, you are getting lost and lost. So we can also not find solutions to things that we can actually, maybe we have the solution for in our own homes. Okay.
Great. Yeah. Would you like to shed some light on the similarities or differences between the Afrocentric perspective and the Western or Eurocentric perspectives that have existed long before now?
Okay. Just like what I mentioned, that for one to arrive to what they know today, then you are basically coming from a certain lived experience, right?
Right.
So we are not replacing the Eurocentric. We are not replacing any other centric. We are saying that there's an Asian experience, there's an African experience, there's a European experience that informs the investigations that people do, right?
Right.
So this, whatever the centrics that are there, we do not really mind much about that. But we are much concerned about the lived experiences of African people.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So that is what informs each and every person when they carry research, investigation.
Right.
You understand now?
Right.
So Afrocentric is not there to compete with any other knowledges that are available. We are here just to find a place for an African person who is conducting research within the African space. Right?
Right.
You understand? So there's a long, like you shall see when I'm connecting how I apply Afrocentric to my research.
Yeah.
You will find that there's long knowledge that has been neglected.
Yeah. Right.
Why was it neglected from the mainstream? It is because we are coming from a lived narrative of other people.
Right.
That is not us. But if you are understanding how African conceive knowledge, then you will be able to pick up on the practices that has informed the current generation, that informed the older generations on the problems that we are facing today. Just like we are saying that climate change is not something that has started now.
Right.
It's something that has started
many
generations before, and our forefathers have known how to deal with it.
Great. Yeah. So now I want you to talk about how this Afrocentric perspective comes to play in the intellectual discourse on climate change, which is something you do very often in your research.
Yes. So for me now, as an Afrocentric researcher or a young scholar that is adopting this theory, I bring that novelty to the climate change discourse. where I apply Afrocentric theory to climate change adaptation. Why have I chosen to do that? Well, there are other theories that can explain this. But for me to understand the adaptation practices that have been practiced by our forefathers up to the current era that we are living in,
Yeah.
then we need to apply Afrocentricity. So now, Afrocentricity now, it demands historicity and culture, right?
Right.
So it demands history and culture. That's what I'm using. Those are the key tenets that I am using.
Great.
History and culture. So I go back to a history of a people. For in this case, the Ndau people in Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
That's a minority group, but they've existed for a long time. They've got practices that they
Have transferred across generations.
yes, transferred maybe through oral tradition, maybe through songs.
Interesting.
Right? But these practices are very essential. So now you shall see that why another centric will not work and or why their knowledge has been neglected for so long. Right?
Right.
Okay. So now using the two tenets, the historicity and culture. So you have to, I have to say it like this. You have to stripe away what you know about climate change. And then you go into an African setting. Then you start asking right questions, like know where these people are coming from. A particular people that you are investigating, you have to know where they are coming from. You understand now?
Right.
So if you know the history of the Shona or the Ndau or the Ndebele people, their practices, how they've adjusted over this, then you start now unpacking it. So using history and culture
Right.
through my work, that's when I now unpack the indigenous knowledge practices that informs adaptation.
Great.
You understand?
Great.
So there are quite a number of them that informs adaptation among the African communities. So if you are to come from Asia and you want to look at adaptation, it's rarely that you're going to go into indigenous knowledges of Africa. You are going to look for what you are familiar with.
Yeah.
But if you are to, if you are in your mind, you are informed by Afrocentric theory, you are going to be demanded to go to a history of one particular people that you are researching on. Then you are going to draw out the indigenous practices that they are using. You are going to draw upon the cultural practices that they practice.
Basically, I think indigenous scholars describe the indigenous context to be embedded. I think you have explained that already, where the practices are interconnected to the philosophies and different, models that they operate with that defines what their lived experiences are. And if anyone invades that space without understanding these practices, even when you invade with the intention, or let me not use the word invade, even when you come in with the intention of providing solution to problems or contributing to better their lives, you may be complicating the problems because you don't understand what their experiences are. And that's really interesting. And so let's talk some more about these indigenous practices, because this perspective has been missing in intellectual discourses for a while. I'm also sure that some of the indigenous people would have gotten to an extent of invalidating their own experiences or questioning their realities. How do you think we can take this knowledge, especially this emerging discourse in the intellectual space now, back to those people and inform them that their reality is valid and what they are doing can actually be improved upon to contribute to current global solutions?
Exactly. So what you are bringing is very important. Let's look at it and say that you bring your own, you have money and you want to foster in a solution.
Yeah.
One thing for sure that we need to be aware of, and also explains why many programs have failed so far.
Yeah.
It's because we leave people in our own designing of the projects that we are bringing into the space. You understand?
Yeah.
So now, even if we are to come to such organizations like IPCC, you'll find that the question that comes first is, who is writing for the international organization? Who is the author, right? And whose voice do you represent?
Great.
So obviously, the person that is authoring is also carrying the voice of the person that they represent.
Yes.
So as long as indigenous authors are outside, are not included within the police arena, then it also means that whatever the perspectives that they carry is also not what represented. So if we want to really connect with the indigenous population, then we need indigenous people on the policy making. You see?
Great.
So if the governments in Africa are really serious about engaging with the indigenous people, then we also need indigenous authors on the policy making. Okay?
Right.
So that is what we call co-designing. You are involving the authors, you are involving the communities. Right?
Right.
So because now we have got the awareness that the practices that our communities were doing in the past are very informative even now.
How relevant are these practices to modern days?
Well, that's interesting, right?
Right.
I can safely say that they are very relevant. They are very relevant. Why would I say they are very relevant? You wait until you see a crisis, then you will know that it's very relevant. Okay, we had COVID-19, right?
Right.
When people were actually fearing for their lives, you know, if you were to go to Africa now, I would tell you that they resorted back to the indigenous healing practices.
Right.
And probably if you ask others, they will tell you that's why we never actually had more death.
Yeah.
You understand?
Right.
But same applies when you go to our local practices in Africa now. You find that by preserving, let's say, preservation of sacred forests. If you were to check the logic behind preservation of forests, it was to maintain the environment,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And also to maintain the sources of water. You understand?
Yes.
There are trees that actually keep water.
Yes.
If you cut those trees, it means also groundwater will also
Dry out.
You see now.
Yeah.
So that's exactly why I would say that indigenous practices needs to be promoted through the local chiefs. I don't know if you call them chiefs there in your country, but through the local chiefs, we need to maintain the indigenous practices. Okay, like I was telling you that drawing from Afrocentricity now, if I come to someone who is in Asia or in Europe and say that, you know what, my people used to do rain making ceremonies and others still do them, those practices, you would say you are crazy because it cannot be explained by scientific testing or anything, experiments or whatever. But I can safely say to you that rain making ceremonies were very useful, and those who are still practicing them is still useful to them. You understand now?
Yes.
Right? Let me give you also another thing. We also have what we call their community food banks. Like, I don't know if you have such in your country, but we also have community food banks where the times that maybe it was actually borrowing from if you have a biblical narrative of Joseph, where when during the times of harvest, you keep something. In Zimbabwe, we actually have what you call Zundera Mambo. That is a practice where people would bring whatever they have, some of their extra produce to the king's the food bank, sort of. Yeah. So now, let me explain now. If you are to check now the rainfall patterns in Southern Africa, like right now in Zimbabwe and so in the rest of Southern region, just recently we're suffering from drought, right? Okay? We're suffering from drought. But now we have entered a season where we are receiving more rain. This, by scientific explanation, Southern Africa is influenced, weather is influenced by El Nino and La Nina. Okay? El Nino phenomenon, it ensures that there's no rain for some certain period of time, probably for 2 to 3 years, 2 to 3, 4 years. And then La Nina, it brings the air the wind that brings what? Rain. Like now, if you go to Zimbabwe, okay, let me say it's 2020, 2025, just for future references for others. Right now, people in Southern Africa are having good rainfall. So meaning they're also bound to have a good Bamba harvest. If we are to resort back to the actual practices that we had, then it means that extra food that we have, it has to go to the king's food bank. But it may not go to the kings now, but it can also go to the government, right?
Yeah.
But that is through community responsibility, right?
Right.
So at the end of the day, that you will find that by the time that we have our drought, we still have what we have for our community as well as for the government. But for the government, we are selling so that we get money. But for the community, we may actually be keeping for the harsher time, harsh periods, right?
Right.
So it means the practice is very important, right? So we also had a situation where people can actually come together through a practice called Nimbe, where people come together and work on your farm, and then they go work on another person's farm. That is a direct response to labor shortages. Look at how migration is affecting people right now. People are moving from rural areas going to urban areas, and more African-able young people are moving to Europe. Some are moving to America for better opportunities, meaning that we are leaving older people in the rural areas without people that can work on the land. So if we are to continue the practices of Nimbe, which is a practice that brings people together and work on some certain, do you know that whilst they are working on that piece of land, if that particular family had no seeds, some people would bring their seeds to that family and they grow crops together. If you're having a shortage of labor, then that one is solved. You see now. So at some point you find that oneness, that African Ubuntu, that is what made us survive the critical times and ensure that every household is food security secure. You see now.
Interesting.
So these practices, you can never do away with them. Just like on my chart, I was showing you that we have got predictors for drought. We have predictors for harsh weather that may be coming. So those are the practices that may be neglected by the younger generation. But at the same time, if they are conscientized, because we are saying as Afrocentric researchers, that we should recenter the psychology of people, right? How people think. We need to recenter, reconfigure how Africans think. So if the younger generation live these practices, we need to reconfigure them so that they are aware that there are practices that are good for themselves.
Right.
Okay.
Right. This actually, all you have explained resonates so much with some of the things I've read and some of the things that also I come across in my own research. For instance, I have discovered that some of these practices and many more that you've explained, typically the traditional practices mostly underpin the local economy of these people. And for a long time, we have overlooked those practices and always ran towards something that that appeared to be more central and alien to the communities. And that seemed to have been some of the reasons why, if you look at the typical African society nowadays, in most of the contexts, their challenges have been exacerbated. The issue of climate change has received, or food security, for instance, has received huge fundings in recent decades, but have only, been getting worse and worse over time. And that tells you that there is something fundamentally wrong somewhere, but most of the times we don't question that. And I think that's part of what the Afrocentric perspective has come to answer. In fact, I have also seen a concept that seems to have its root in Ghana, or from the indigenous people in Ghana, called Sankofa. It means go back and get it. And nowadays, even in management sciences, that is already gaining currency. People are already talking about how we need to go back, look back, and pick up things that we have long neglected, as they seem to hold the solution to our problems. Because our forefathers or the previous generations wouldn't have just, used those things for nothing. Remember that they didn't have the sophisticated technologies we have today. So they have, over time, evolved and developed those practices and logics as a way of addressing some of the problems they were faced with. And it seems to have worked so long and served their generation and up to this time. But over time, we seem to have left it. Now, I would want to engage you in something that I think I see quite often. This Afrocentric perspective is mostly seen as an alternative. But in your initial explanation, you explained that it is the center. It is a perspective that puts Africa as the center. But sometimes I have seen in literature where it is placed as an alternative. What do you have to say about that?
Okay, that's a very interesting assertion. I would not say it's an alternative. It's not an alternative. It's actually how we should go about it.
So would you say that it is only Africans that should go that way, or anybody else can go that way, or
Anybody else? Like I told you that it's okay. I'm actually against scaling up solutions to one solution to the another.
Yeah.
We should try to find, that's why I said we should now promote co-designing wherever it could be. Promote co-designing when you're designing of solutions, you understand?
Right.
So if we are to like I said, these are practices sometimes that are practiced by our own people. Right. So I may not try to impose that upon the Americans, but we know for sure that those people in Asia, they have also their own lived experiences, which are very critical when you are profiling in solutions.
Right.
You understand now? Now for Africans, like we have, I like how the Zimbabwean government has just done it. I don't know how to what extent is success, but we have what we call the Operation Pumvudza. It's a conservation farming technique, sort of, where you can dig a hole and then plant seedlings. But to some extent, it preserves water, right?
Right.
So that can be done it's done on a
large scale,
lower scale, at family household. But then we also have now irrigation that people are now aware of. It's done at a large scale. But what's important now is we have already catered for the household food security. You understand? So the modern techniques can always work hand in hand with
these local techniques,
indigenous knowledge systems. So it's not the alternative. It should go hand in hand.
Great.
Yes.
Great. I think you explained that earlier, and it's interesting that naturally the conversation has reified that again. And it brings me to the issue of small scale actors or smallholder farmers.
Yes.
For a long time, I have read a couple of papers also that have criticized or criticized smallholder farming as part of what is, contributing to the challenge of food security or food insecurity in Africa. You that have been in that space for a while, what would you say? What can you say about it? Is that really the reality? We're talking about the lived experiences now.
Now that's important. We want as many small scale farmers as possible. You see why? Because now where we are coming from, we remember Africans moved from being owners of the land to being colonized, right?
Right.
And then we moved now to independence. So the critical thing that was the critical issue in Southern Africa was who is supposed to own the land. Okay. So in Zimbabwe, we just had the fast track land reform program that had its own consequences. Yes, we moved from being the fruit basket of Africa to being maybe the case of Africa because of different issues, right?
Yeah.
Or different political dynamics. But one thing that Zimbabweans will never regret, that is owning their own land. Even if they do not have, probably they may not have the capacity right now to earn the fruits from that land, right? But one thing for sure, that if you ask any average Zimbabwean, they will tell you that they are proud to have that land in their hands. And I can see also the way the trajectory is moving. South Africa just announced recently that they are also expropriating the land. Why? Because we need new smallholder farmers, because you can only emancipate people through farming. We can only emancipate our people through land. Okay. If I'm to tell you, we have about 30% of South Africans owning land as black people, and then about 70% of the white people who were the previous colonial masters. So now you can imagine, as much as we want to preserve food security at household level, what is the situation? Then we also have now in Zimbabwe, of course, that we have the black people that are owning land, right?
Yeah.
But probably there are also situations that things that comes with it that needs to be fixed. Like for instance, people there, they need title deeds. They need ownership of that land. You understand?
Yeah.
For them to be able to go to the bank and get money to finance their own farming. Okay.
Yeah.
So there are quite a number of things that needs to be fixed for Zimbabwe to actually gain the fruits of that land. Okay.
Right.
So basically, what I'm saying is smallholder farmers are quite important.
I get that. Now it again rings a bell, because it really fits into the African narrative, which is usually a bottom-up approach to problem solving, as against the central narrative that we grew up to realize, which is top-down.
Yeah.
Now, and that sounds to me like one approach that we really need to explore in order to pursue the issue of food security, which is very fundamental to economic growth, by the way.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, over the years, especially in recent times, there have been lots of efforts to really solve this problem. But I see most of the efforts have always been from the top-down approach, and it doesn't seem to work. So I think it calls to questioning what perhaps is going on wrongly and what needs to be checked and what can be done. And this that you have said now, or you've explained, sounds so much like what is natural, what appears to be the natural solution, empowering individuals or empowering the micro units, which is the households,
Yes.
to pursue their own food sufficiency. And in attaining that height, I remember also that usually in the excesses are usually transferred to a kind of food bank, which you've explained earlier, and sometimes even can end up in the market and empower these farmers even more. But let's talk some more about the issues of climate change and mitigation and adaptation, which is something you have also been writing about. How have these local farmers been dealing with this issue, especially since it's not something that is new?
Yeah, that's where there is a biggest challenge there. Like issues that I'm just mentioning to you, that for one to adapt, besides talking about indigenous knowledge systems and stuff, when it comes to small farmers now, we talk of, I don't know, we once discussed about this, we talk about microfinance, right? Access to that. So if you do not have access to funds, adapting is equally a challenge, right? Also talk of funds that are put into irrigation. Okay? Yes. Because now we are moving, our adaptation process is moving from, we moved from copying, right? First of all, we in adaptation, we may say that you can choose to do nothing, right? And then you suffer the consequences. And then secondly, you can move to copying, right? Where you are introducing new fertilizers or also finding any other sources of funds to withstand the drought. But now where we've got incremental, and then we are moving to transformational adaptation. And I am also more of an advocate of transformational adaptation practices now. Transformational adaptation now, even though it's expensive to fund irrigation, but it is necessary. Even if it is expensive to build new dams, but it is also what? Necessary. Why? Because it gives permanent structures that allows people to adapt for longer periods. You understand? The challenge is building back to where the problems were before. When we experience the same, we still find ourselves struggling again. So now what's needed in an African setting is to have more funds being poured into setting up of irrigation systems, right? Yeah.
Okay. Another thing I also want us to shed a little light on is you, myself, and several others in the intellectual space have been exploring this perspective for a long time. How can we, involve the local people, especially some of them who may not have a university degree, but they are very conversant with these practices, and sometimes they also occupy the weakest power position. The
women,
local
people.
I'm referring to local people generally, both men and women, who are not in any power position. They literally rely on what comes from top down.
Yeah.
So how my question is, how can we empower them to maintain agency? Because of course they are rich in terms of their knowledge, in terms of their experiences. They are rich, and what they know is valuable, as we have discussed so far in providing solution to some of the complexities and challenges that's befalling society today. So my question, how do we empower them to maintain agency, to continue to play an active role in balancing the knife edge?
Like I mentioned before, we have got, if you are going to the local level, there are villages, right? Villages. Then when you look at the structures of power, we have the traditional leaders, right? Then we have also agriculture extension agents who come to the communities. Then we also have local NGOs.
By the way, sorry, I'm going to cut you real quick.
Yes.
Let's talk about agricultural extension agents.
Yes.
I read a lot about them, and they are always the ones that interface between the community.
Yes.
And whose lens? You started with that question earlier. Whose lens do they really go with? Can we, especially having been dominated by a different lens all these years? So whose lens are they really operating with?
That's the most important question that you are asking now. First of all, we need to stripe away our Western thinking, right? And we need to stripe away any prior knowledge that we may think that we know, right? And try to resonate with the communities where we operate from, right? So that is exactly where maybe the challenge is, where people come and impose to the local communities rather than learn from them what they need to implement within. You understand?
Yeah.
So I think that's where the challenge is. But one thing for sure that I prefer coming from the agriculture extension agents could be the weather knowledge, right?
Yes.
Yes. And also trying to educate new farmers, even on the practices that the indigenous practices that we already have. You understand?
Right.
So that education of indigenous knowledge, it also needs to be fostered into the our agricultural extension officers that are going into different communities,
Field, yeah.
right? So they bring that organization. Like for instance, one example I gave you of our local NGO in the place that I collected data in, Shimanimani in Zimbabwe. You find that they bring out farmers together for the seed banks, sharing of seeds, right? That ensures that even if I had my own seeds that others are not aware of, already we are sharing together at one particular place. So that sort of coordination can be done by agriculture extension agents as well.
I see.
That's what's very important. So we still refer to where we started the conversation from, where we said that whose voice and whose narrative are you bringing out?
That's the most important.
Yes. So if you're a scholar, like on the policy making first, who are you involving on the board for us to have one particular vision, right?
Right.
If I am an indigenous scholar sitting on a government policy making board, we are going to involve indigenous knowledges, right?
Right.
So also our agriculture extension agencies are also going to do the same, because it's trickling down from up to bottom. Right?
Right.
And then if there's that particular sharing of knowledge, then we have got both scientific and indigenous knowledges fused up together.
Yeah. That's why nowadays there's also this issue of co-creation.
Yeah, that's co-design.
Yeah, that is also gaining prominence. Now, this is a very interesting conversation. Of course, it is weaved with complexities, but it's something that borders on reality in very valid, or would I say lived experiences of people that are very important, but most of the times don't have the voice, like we've explained so far. We're wrapping up. But one other thing I want to hit on a little bit is on the finance. You've talked about microfinance.
Yes.
Which is a way of organizing at the micro level. Now, I want to bring in NGOs because I think they have been more actively involved in this process nowadays. But before I go there, I want to establish a little bit of a premise. Historically, indigenous communities have had their own way of organizing even finances before the emergence of, banking, the central banking systems. Then or during those times, I think I can describe it like a decentralized kind of banking system where communities had something you've described, maybe, for example, a seed bank. People also had thrifts or community groups where they contribute money and save with each other. People had ways of supporting themselves with farms through a practice. What did you call it in the Zimbabwean language? Where organized labor going to a
yeah, we have got a Nimbe.
Okay, Nimbe practices. And we can go on and on. There were lists or catalog of
Nimbe, we've got Mishandera Bangwe. Mishandera Bangwe also bringing people together where you work on one particular.
Beautiful. Yeah. So all of those were typical practices that contributed to the local economy, and one can even place monetary values on some of those efforts, right? Those times, these community actors or these indigenous stakeholders weren't looking for banks to take loans with huge interests, which is something they are faced with nowadays. They had their own ways of organizing and getting things sorted at the local level. Of course, not to sound like it was very efficient, but it was working in some way and on some scale. My question now is, considering the emergence of different forms and different avenues of interventions nowadays, how do you think we can leverage these financial knowledge or local economic knowledge, that some of which you have highlighted, to ensure that these problems are addressed. Because, for instance, in the issue of the USAID that is making the rounds now, we've seen billions of dollars and millions and thousands being pumped into different contexts across different parts of the world, not just Africa, but Asia and everywhere, almost every region. But one thing I've seen on X quite loudly is the people calling out for those funds to be cut because they weren't feeling the impact. People coming out to say, look, our community, we didn't even know these things existed. So how do we make money or whatever interventions we're doing to deliver value to the people that can indeed set them up, transform their lives, and help them to grow locally?
Okay, I think we like what you mentioned just now of how aid is cut from international donors and all, but I think using Afrocentric approach there, finding our own space, finding our own narrative, finding our own solutions, I think we can still go back to funding our own local initiatives, right? Because we cannot now remove that people need funds.
Yes.
People need funds.
Yes.
You understand? Right? But it goes back now to priorities that the government has with its own people. You understand?
Right.
So now it's a matter of governance issue that we are addressing here. Okay?
I see.
So yes, we do have the local, but we also have the government. We cannot negate that, right? So with all the resources that we have, to some extent now there's a need for prioritization to fund our local initiatives. We cannot negate the role that the government has to play, okay? Because we say that it's a governance issue, okay? Yeah. We have the resources. Excuse me, I'm focusing more, let's say, for example, I'm putting on Zimbabwe on the spot here. Zimbabwe has the resources like minerals, right? Gold, diamonds, platinum, right? Those are resources that if you are to take money that is generated there and it is trickled into farmers that are at a local scale, then we can have initiatives that are the farming initiatives that are successful. Okay, so once people are there's injection of money for local farming, even the local initiatives that we want, like coming together, small groups of people circulating money, local economies, it will also prosper, just because there's something that is reached to them first. So the most important thing why many Africans are saying we should cut aid is because it demands our government, it demands local business people to actually invest more into the local initiatives. You understand? Locally generated solutions. And that is what Afrocentric is all about, where we are driving for our self-sustenance. I would give a referral to Norway, who created sovereign wealth, right? To manage the sovereign wealth for Norway is where they manage their own wealth resources for the future generations and the current one. Recently they said that they earned almost about 400 billion in profits. Imagine. So that alone allows the government to cut on the taxes of people, to cut on the educational expenses and all that. And that is exactly what Zimbabweans and Africans should be doing, to find a way where we manage our resources, surely. Then once we manage those resources, there's a trickling in now to our initiatives like farming at a local scale, right?
Right.
So we also withstand climate change at the end of the day.
Yeah, I get that. As we wrap up, one may argue that the Afrocentric perspective should focus on traditional perspective because that's the model of governance that is indeed African. The idea of what we have today as government, one can argue that it isn't African. It's something that is alien to Africa because it emerged out of colonization. So how do you marry that? How do you integrate this model of governance that is indeed alien to the African history along with Afrocentric perspectives?
Okay. That's a very, 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 very interesting question and political one for sure. Well, not to argue against the kind of form of governance that is available. I always argue that democracy itself is not that beautiful in all its all, right? But there are things that you can always take, okay?
Yeah.
There are things that are very essential to humans. I always tell people that even if, this is not scientific that I'm saying, but this is an opinion rather, even if we take an authoritarian king, because in Africa we always have a king, right?
Yes.
Authoritarian regime, and then you take democracy, right?
Yeah.
One thing for sure that you need to ensure that is there's a rule of law, okay? Then you should also ensure that there's when you put the rule of law, then also it means that there's respect for property, right?
Yeah.
Just like what we say that we have many farmers that on our local economy that do not have ownership. They are farming, but they don't have ownership of the land. So to some extent, there's no guarantee whether they will be owning this land later. You see what I mean? So that alone, that's not sustainable in terms of moving the country forward. So there are things that you can never substitute. Rule of law, right to property, judiciary, right? Fair judiciary. So all those things, whether it's under the a dictatorial leadership or it's under a democratic leadership, those are the essentials that are very important. So even if we are to go back to the traditional leadership, there was always respect for property rights. You understand? If you were corrupt in our past year, our forefathers will make sure that you are punished dearly. So as Africans, that's now my message. If you are to get rid of our corrupt tendencies, and then you ensure there's a rule of law, and then you ensure that the judiciary is fair, then you find that everything else will be fine.
All right, that's clear.
Yeah.
And one last remark you have for someone out there who is thinking of, perhaps exploring this Afrocentric perspective, or someone in the community or someone somewhere who is thinking of what to do, what advice or remark would you have for them just as we wrap up?
That's interesting. So always ask yourself your question, how do I arrive to what I know today? So if you want to ask a question, you are questioning yourself on, is this based on the experiences of Africa? Is this based on our experiences? What would an African do in the absence of other people, right? We are not substituting the knowledge that is emanating from other parts of the world, but we are saying that an African has the right to write their own narratives. You are the subject of history. You have to practice your agents. So put whatever the question that you want to answer, always try to find the place for an African person. Always find the place for an African narrative built by our own experiences. So we are sort of answering the epistemic question on whose narrative do you base your findings? Whose narrative do you place your story? Africans have a story to tell, be it in history, climate change, in economy. We have our own story to tell. and finding that place is our goal.
What an incredible way to end it. Thank you very much for this very incredible closing remark, and thank you for the very rich conversation. It's been a pleasure having you on this episode. On this note, we'll bring it to a wrap. Please remember to subscribe to this channel, share your thoughts in the comment section, and also feel free to share this video to your friends and loved ones. See you on the next one. Bye for now.